I'm Duncan McLeod, and this is the TechCentral Show. If you're new to these parts, subscribe to us on YouTube at youtube.com/TechCentral. And while you're doing it, why not subscribe to our newsletter at techcentral.co.za/newsletter and get the latest local and international tech news and these interviews delivered to your inbox at 5 a.m. every morning. Now, pleased to welcome our first ever guest from MTN on the show. Quintus de Beer is head of wholesale at MTN South Africa, and he's got big plans to turn the company into the biggest player in the wholesale telecoms solution market in South Africa. Quintus, good to see you. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting us.
What does the wholesale division of a telco do typically? Take us through your day-to-day work.
Look, I think fundamentally we are there to basically monetize the network. Mm-hmm. There's big investments that go into the network, and we need to find ways to monetize it. So we basically specialize dealing with wholesale partners. So that effectively is people that take our wholesale product and convert it into retail product. So they have their own brand, their own pricing, their own marketing, their own everything. So we're not prescriptive in terms of what they do there, and we monetize it. We monetize it at different levels. So we have what people now know as the MVNO business. We do national roaming, so that's the likes of Cell C and Telkom. Mm-hmm. Then we've got fixed services in there, which is less known, but we do offer some FTTH product in there on the wholesale side. And then we've got a division which looks after what we call carrier services. Mm-hmm. So that's interconnect. So that's when you start to interconnect between ourselves and Vodacom. So when you make a call to the Vodacom network from MTN, we're the part in the middle that helps with the commercials and the technical integration.
Okay. There must be quite a bit of complexity in that integration between the operators. What's involved?
A couple of things. I think on the one side, we have to deal with regulations. So the interconnect business is very regulated. Mm-hmm. And then on the technology side, there is currently SS7-based technologies that's available. That's what existed before. Mm-hmm. But now people are moving more and more into IP business. So now you have to start to integrate on an IP level to improve efficiencies and also the products and services that can be offered.
Now, I know historically Vodacom and MTN as the two market leaders in South Africa have been a bit reluctant to offer wholesale services. Historically, Cell C was the only player in the market for many years with MVNO enablement services, and they carried Virgin Mobile, of course, for many years, and other operators or other MVNOs on their network. But there was a shift in the market a few years ago, and I think MTN was probably first out of the starting gates in the race certainly between MTN and Vodacom, in offering these sort of wholesale services. But what triggered it? Why did you decide historically not to offer MVNO enablement services to now this being a key part of your strategy?
Look, I think previously there was some question marks around commercial viability. Mm-hmm. It's always a challenge because you can think of an MVNO as a business like any other business. You need distribution, you need payment methods, you need somebody that understands telco and can convert that product. So we were always nervous about that. What we realized over a period of time was that the market is maturing, there is opportunities opening up, and technology makes things cheaper as well for people to start to integrate into the network. Then we said, well, at that point in time, let's consolidate the business. We create a standalone business unit to take care of that. And from a group perspective as well, there was a guidance that we need to understand what else we can do to monetize network assets, not just to the retail arms. So effectively what we've done now is created this business unit. And then we had to look at what propositions we can put together, and MVNO was one of the natural choices. Mm-hmm. There's various flavors of how you can implement MVNO. So we support a model that worked for us, and I think works very well for the partners that have elected us.
Okay, can you give us some flavor of how that model works?
We effectively try and put as much of the control as possible from a pricing perspective and a proposition perspective into the MVNO hands. Mm-hmm. Traditionally, you would find that you find a reseller model. Yeah. And in a reseller model, effectively, you take a SIM card of the operator. Yeah. You can brand it in whatever branding you want, but the product underneath is still the network operator product. So you are limited in terms of how you want to go to market to an extent, or at least that's our belief. And what we have done is we've said we're not giving you those constraints. You can go into the market in any way you want. You find people that only wants to use it for loyalty. Mm-hmm. To incentivize people for it. You find people that wants to use it as an enabler, and then you find people that actually wants to monetize the product itself. Now you cannot do that if you just have one model in terms of how you can operate. So we believe we've found the right flexibility for people to come to us and build their propositions, large and small organizations.
How many MVNOs do you have on your network now?
We use a concept that we call a VNO, which is the virtual network operator. There we sit with 30 plus partners as we speak, which is a mix of data only, voice only, messaging only customers, and then also a mix.
Yeah.
Where you have a combination of these services. And each one of them have implemented it differently, pricing it differently, and then try and build a proposition out of that.
Okay. So who are some of the bigger players who are on your network? I know you've announced Pick and Pay. What are some of the other names you've announced publicly at this stage?
They've got TFG.
TFG?
Yes. MultiChoice.
Oh yes, I forgot about them, yeah.
They're quite a big one. And there's a couple in the pipeline that we will soon be able to disclose once we get past our NDA stage, which I think will also be very exciting for the market, also big brands that will be deploying. Those are the biggest. And then you've got people like Afrihost, Access,
Triple ISP type.
Got all of them as well in there. You would see Afrihost has also now started with their MVNO, voice and data services and data only and fiber services. So that whole bouquet is what we can offer at this point in time.
Right. So interesting times in this market. How do you measure as MTN your success in this space? You say you want to be the number one wholesale provider in this market by 2025. How do you measure that? Is it based on the number of virtual customers on MVNOs who happen to be on your network? Is it the number of MVNOs that have signed up with you? How do you measure success?
Look, I think it's a healthy debate, even still today in MTN.
Okay.
Typically, any retail business is measured on the number of subscribers and the ARPUs and everything else that comes with it. The discussion we had internally in our organization is one that says, well, if somebody uses this for loyalty-based services, then your ARPU there will be extremely small, if at all.
Yeah.
Versus somebody that actually monetizes it, you get to a bigger number. So for us, it's a revenue share, in short.
Okay.
Subscribers is obviously important for certain reasons, but that's not our primary driver. It's about the value we can extract because eventually we monetize the network.
Do you insist on a floor for pricing with your partners in the MVNO space, so that there isn't, so that these guys don't come in and effectively compete with you on price and drive the whole market lower? Is that something that you look at with them? Is that something you can look at?
I think you must also understand that we sit in a highly regulated market.
Yeah.
And then you also have competition law that you need to contend with. And in competition law, there's two key concepts that we always have to keep in mind. The one is predatory pricing, and the other one is margin squeeze.
Right.
So whenever we look at pricing, we need to make sure that there's enough margin in there for the wholesale partner to also have a sustainable business, but not at the level that you completely, I would say, would just dump the whole market and eventually they go bankrupt in any case because they cannot afford to offer those services.
Yeah.
And what you tend to find, as you will see in a lot of the guys that really just play the price game, they soon disappear. Because it's not just a price game, it's a value proposition that you put on top of it that actually makes the difference.
So if one of the MVNOs on your network suddenly slashes the price of calls to 1 cent a minute, etc., you'd have a conversation with them to ensure that the market isn't...
Not really, because they are independent businesses.
Right.
And you do find, I think, all the different marketing techniques, which is loss leaders, just having a shout in the market where you pin one price point, but that's not actually what you are selling.
Right.
There's some people who launched uncapped at 2,000 or 3,000 rands a month. It sounded great, but it was actually very expensive. So one need to be very careful in the market about these shout-outs in terms of headline tariffs.
Right.
You really need to look at the basket completely to understand, and then eventually, these guys run a distribution business, they've got people to pay, they've got call centers to run. So you can only sustain that for a very short period of time, and then they fall out of the market.
Let's talk a bit about your relationship with Cell C and Telkom. Both of those operators roam on your network in some sort of capacities. How do those roaming agreements differ to the MVNO arrangements that you have with other players in the market? Are they quite similar in nature?
Look, I think if you generalize it to the greatest extent, they take capacity off the network.
Right.
But where the subtle differences, specifically for the roaming arrangements, is you actually have people that contract you and say, I want a slice of your network. And what we then create is a virtual partition, and we allow them in to operate in that slice. So We can't see what's happening inside of that slice. We just know there's traffic being consumed.
It's all theirs.
It's all theirs. And they can use that traffic, and then that they can obviously then repackage and sell back into the market. So it's almost, if you want to have an analogy, it's like if you have a supplier of a tower and a radio equipment, it could be anybody. It could have been a Huawei, a ZTE, Ericsson, anybody else. We're in a similar position now. The only difference is they don't want to talk to the guy that supplies electricity, that does the maintenance and the security. They come to us and they get a one-stop shop, and there's one bill instead of 50 bills and all the admin that sits behind it.
Okay. So do you think we're going to see more operators coming into this market on this basis of roaming, or do you think that South Africa is a very mature market from a mobile perspective?
Look, I think there will be more of it.
Yeah.
I think from a regulatory perspective, there is some challenges that we need to overcome, I think, as a country.
Yeah.
But it makes absolutely sense to try and share infrastructure where you can, to offer better services into the market. I mean, you've seen all the commentary around vandalism, how electricity is impacting the networks, and those things cost a hell of a lot of money. So especially for the smaller operators, it becomes almost impossible to maintain their own networks if you can't share that cost to some extent.
We've seen Cell C getting out of the market. They no longer operate, or they're busy excreting themselves from operating their own radio access network. Telkom still has its own infrastructure, and of course there's Vodacom and MTN. In the longer term, Quintus, how many infrastructure players do you think this market can support?
I guess if you ask every MNO, they will give you a different number. We think it's 2. That's our view.
So there's no space for Telkom to be an infrastructure player in mobile in this country?
Well, I think eventually they will run out of money to sustain this thing.
Yeah.
But again, that's my view.
Okay.
They will have a view that says there can be at least 3. We think it eventually will boil down to 2, just because of the cost that is associated with it and the management that is required behind it.
Right. And how long do you think that shakeout of the market is going to take?
That depends. No, look, I think it's a 5-10 year kind of thing that we need to look at. And also, when you start to look at the 5G technologies and what you can do with it, you will start to see all kinds of new players coming in into the market that want that little slice on the network that they can sell to other people. So you might actually find some new players coming into the market that we've never seen before that will also start to offer telco services, but in this virtualized world.
Yeah.
And maybe that will create the third infrastructure player to also be viable.
Right.
But our view still is we'll end up with 2.
With two main players in infrastructure. So Quintus, there's been a lot of activity in the MVNO market. For many years, there was only one player in the market in the form of Virgin Mobile, which, as you know, worked through, Cell C was the network on which they operated. And Cell C, subsequent to that, many years later, launched a lot more MVNOs onto its network. Now all the networks are opening up, whether because they were required to buy a CASA in the spectrum auction or doing it of their own volition, which it sounds like in MTN's case, you're seeing it as a business opportunity. But there have been a lot of MVNOs launched just in the last couple of years. All the banks seem to be heading in that direction, retailers, you name it. There's across the board, there's MVNOs being launched. Where does this all end up? Is this market going to become over-traded? What lessons can we learn from markets like the UK, where there was a boom in MVNOs at some point years ago? And are we going to see a similar sort of trajectory in South Africa, where perhaps there's consolidation and some MVNOs leaving the market? What are the experiences you've seen in other markets? Tell us about what's going to happen locally.
Now, look, I think that's the reality. I think the issue is for an MVNO, it's about your value proposition and in the price at which you can offer it. And therefore, people that is only going to try and play the price game is not going to survive in the market. If you look at an international level, the people that really survived had a proper value proposition, either customer experience, a digital journey, or specific unique content, or linked to any loyalty programs that they can operate in. So yes, you will find a couple of them coming into the market, and unfortunately, you will find a number of them that may not survive. So you will find some consolidation. And I think eventually you will find that even on the MVNO level, you will find what we call aggregators that will have a platform, and they will put all these small guys on, but it will be one wholesale, sub-wholesale entity that will allow very small guys to come in and do a 10 or 20,000 SIM kind of base and still successfully manage it, because they share the overall cost from an aggregator perspective.
Right. Okay. So
you'll find these little businesses sitting in there, but there will be consolidation eventually. The question is just when.
Right. And we've actually seen some of these enablement businesses in the local market already. I think, I forget his name now, but the chap who used to run Virgin Mobile heads one up.
Yeah. From huge group, yeah.
Yeah, a huge group. Yeah.
It's TCS, I think.
Yeah, they're doing some interesting work, huge group in the space, actually. Are you working with them at all?
Yes.
You are? Okay. Okay. Can you elaborate on that in terms of what you're doing?
Well, not on a platform level, but they are an MVNO of us.
Okay.
So they are supplying in two of their subsidiaries, there's data services as well as voice services that they are offering.
Okay.
The platform side is something that they've gone down the path. We got a couple of enablers, as you've mentioned. You've got the MVNX, MVNEs of the world. Then you just stepped into the market. And then you would see with Afrihost and these guys, they bring in their own platforms. So we allow a model where you can have your own platforms, or you can come through a third party, come into our network as well.
So it's almost if you approach MTN to do this, there's a checkbox of things you want to do, and you work out the pricing and packages around based on what you need. Yeah. Okay, so how big is this market going to get? I know BMIT put out some research some time ago where I think they said ultimately this market's going to grow to, I think they said 12% of the market in 5 years. I forget the exact details. I think that's right. 5 years and 12% of the total subscribers will be with MVNOs. Is that more or less your prediction as well, or do you think the market could get bigger than that?
Look, I think what might make South Africa just a bit more of a challenge is the economic environment. So I think that is something that you always have to consider. MVNOs need funding to survive, to get especially their startup phase. So I think that will influence the growth factor. Can it go to 12%? Absolutely. You find the right propositions, you can. I think the other dynamic that you must just be very careful of in South Africa is the multi-SIMming space. So it doesn't mean if an MVNO comes out and you start to add up all the MVNO subscribers and say, well, it's 12%, you might find that only 3% is uniquely on the MVNO, and the rest already has a second or a third or even a fourth SIM on another network that they are using.
So rather measure it as percentage of total SIMs rather than a percentage of the population.
Yeah, it becomes a very difficult conversation. I mean, if you add up all the SIMs in South Africa as active SIMs, you will realize there's people sitting on 3 or 4 SIMs.
Yeah, we're over 100 million, I believe.
Yes. So the moment you add those numbers up and you put MVNOs in there, it's just another SIM. And on these smartphones, you now can have 2, 3, 4, 5 SIMs. So the multi-SIMming can actually become play even a bigger role.
The most successful MVNOs around the world are there. I mean, ARPUs is average revenue per user is a very important metric that mobile operators or telecommunications operators generally use. There are probably other industries that use ARPU as well. But typically, looking locally and internationally, do MVNOs typically enjoy a higher or a lower ARPU than an MNO?
It depends on their segment and their market. So if you find somebody that plays in the loyalty game, you might find it as low as 20 or 25 rand. But then if you go to the higher end where you've got data providers that offers the data services, you can get to 200-300 rand.
Right.
So it varies quite a bit. So the moment you start to average it out, I guess you will end up eventually at about 80-90 rands as an average between all of them. But we have seen big differences in terms of pricing depending on the niche that they actually are targeting.
Targeting, right. Okay. So is there a particular industry that tends to be more profitable for companies to launch MVNO services, like financial services, for example?
Look, I think what makes any MVNO successful very early on is you already have a client base somewhere.
Right.
And a brand.
And a brand.
Those two things already start to help you to say, well, immediately I know who to contact and say, well, here's an offer, and how I integrate the offer in there. The startup guys are the guys that would struggle because nobody knows you. You need to build the brand. They don't necessarily trust you, and that's where I think where it becomes more difficult for the smaller guys to come in. So established industry, yes. I think the established industry, however, is still skeptical about it, and they need quite a large investment to start up this MVNO business, and they're not necessarily always telco experts. So they can recruit people, obviously, but I think that's where the enablement platforms and aggregated platforms will start to play a bigger role, where people are saying, I want it, but I don't want all that management.
Yes.
Because telco management can become quite difficult to do.
And there are some startups in this space. It's not only established brands. We had Calvin Collett on the show just a couple of weeks ago talking about Melon Mobile, which of course is an MVNO running on MTN's network as well. So there are some startups trying their hand at this, and we'll see how successful they are.
Yeah, if you got the right proposition, you got the right customer experience, there's no reason why you wouldn't succeed.
Out of interest, do you consult at all, or offer consulting services around MVNOs to companies? So let's say a retailer approaches you who doesn't understand the telco space and says to you, actually, can you help us how we position this in the market, that sort of thing, sort of a management consulting service. We want to do an MVNO, but we don't quite know how to position it. Is that sort of advice you provide, or do you immediately go to the connectivity discussion and let's sign the deal and get this going?
Look, I think most of what we have done so far is around the connectivity discussion. Mm-hmm. We have started to build a very multidisciplinary team, and our view is that in the next year or two, we will actually go down that path.
Right.
I think we must always be careful when you go into propositions and so on. Comes back to the regulations. You need to be careful just how you position products in the market, because you're still under the MTN banner. Mm-hmm. And optically, people can still look at it and say, well, you're manipulating the market and the pricing. So you have to find that balance between the two. But it's definitely something that we are working on for the next year or two to have those services available.
Okay. So you're making it sound as if the Competition Commission watches this industry like a hawk. Is that true? Are you being watched all the time?
Well,
I know they had an investigation into the sector, so presumably there is some interest from the Competition Commission in what's happening in this.
No, there's definitely that, and there's also the broadband work that ICASA was doing recently, where effectively they have said, well, in the next 3 years they want all the networks to publish their wholesale retail rates at quite a granular level. And from that basis, they will then understand if this industry requires further regulation. Mm-hmm. And if they see that there is dubious activity, they will hand it back to the Competition Commission. So it's definitely there. And I think just in general, as a good corporate citizen, if you decide to want to make money out of this business, then do it in the right way and do give people a proper chance. There's people's lives and money at stake when you do these businesses. Yeah. So give them a fair chance to run those businesses.
Yeah, for sure. I wanted to ask about MVNOs and why it's taken so long for them to take off in South Africa. I mean, it was, I think they became very popular in the UK 10 to 20 years ago, let's put it like that. And it's been hugely successful in the US as well. And we've seen MVNOs, the model working across Europe and elsewhere in the world. But we really do seem to have been behind the curve here in South Africa, and certainly in terms of the number of MVNOs launched. Why do you think South Africa was so slow in embracing the MVNO model?
I think part of it was to do with the initial cost to establish that business. Mm-hmm. You're taking quite a big punt a couple of years ago to enter that market, and it was very much voice and SMS driven.
Right.
I think with the LTE business coming in, and then now 5G and all the other Gs that will come after this, it just creates more opportunity. The networks are becoming more software defined, so it does lower the cost to run this business. I think it was partially the nervousness around, will this work or not? Our economy is not absolutely first world. Mm-hmm. You have a mix between it. We are a developing economy. So you have to find this recipe that will work for us in the middle.
Yes.
And to do that, people have to focus on their core businesses and then say, well, what else can I do to monetize? And I think it's just that life cycle that we had to go through, mm-hmm. and the economic factors that was keeping us back in the market.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about Cell C. They're one of your most important customers. What's your relationship with with Cell C, and how is the network transfer project coming along?
Yeah. Look, again, as I explained maybe earlier, is that it is a supplier relationship to a large extent, and we're also a customer of theirs on the other end as well. So we also use their capacity for our customers, and they use our capacity for their customers. So I think at that level, the relationship is, I think, in a good place. It has been tough over the last couple of years with the recap that was taking place and the uncertainty and their business really having to find a way to survive. With the recap, they have placed them in a better position to compete. So I think at that level, it is good. Mm-hmm. I think overall, again, if you look at beyond that and you look at the business that we are doing with them, you're now actually allowing people to stay in the market at a lower cost. Mm-hmm. If they had to compete at our level, I think they've published before, their calculations was they would have to spend like 220 billion rand to have similar networks than MTN and Vodacom, which on any investment profile you would have never have done.
Sure.
So what we've actually created is an environment where they can survive and still compete in South Africa. Mm-hmm.
It seems that the industry, and I'm not just talking about the MTN Cell C relationship, but other deals and arrangements in this industry, there's a lot of, how do I phrase this? What's the word? There's a lot of dancing and fancy legwork going on because of the regulatory environments, spectrum trading isn't allowed yet, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of complex deals that we've seen around spectrum sharing that have emerged in the last little while. Before we wrap today, Quintus, I'd like to get a view from you on what perhaps ICASA and policymakers in South Africa could be doing to make to deal with some of these challenges that you're facing. I'm thinking specifically around spectrum trading, but other regulatory interventions that could actually make this market more efficient and competitive. Because working together with other players in the space isn't necessarily anti-competitive in itself. What are some of the things you'd like to see as MTN change from a regulatory and policy perspective? And I'm particularly looking at this through the wholesale angle.
Yes.
To make this market better.
Look, I think the first one for us sits around, if you want to call it the spectrum space, and giving us more flexibility in order to use spectrum to assist partners. You think about private networks coming on board. How do you create a private network without spectrum? And you want to do it on your own, you can't. So I think the whole issue around spectrum trading, pooling, selling, make that a more predictable model that you don't have to do all of the other hard work to get it done, so it becomes transactional. I think the other part that you touch on is the Competition Commission and the laws in the country. Let us try and create scale. Scale is just something that is good for everybody in this industry. I think the last one is kind of a narrative that the government has worked on and that ICASA has started to publish, which is this requirement that you must have an open network for the MVNOs.
Yes.
I think there's more work that can be done in terms of enterprise development to find ways to actually incentivize businesses to help these small partners to grow. I mean, if you have a little community somewhere out in the sticks somewhere, why not create the ability with some funding to create that last mile connectivity and empower somebody to run a little small business there? Because we think that MVNO has to be this massive national thing. Why not create a smaller view? So that integration of the SME market, the job creation market, how do we bring that back into telco as well and enable the startups to actually enter the market? I mean, the framework is already open. We are an open network. We can do business with everybody. But those, I think, is the main things, is the funding element, the technology, the understanding, and then how do we get the smaller guys to come in? There's lots of job creation opportunities in it, and you can create connected communities in the rest of South Africa.
Fantastic. Great insights. Quintus de Beer is head of wholesale for MTN South Africa. Thanks for coming into the studio today. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.